I see you. You there, in your big city, with your big city internet access, effortlessly pulling up the location of your next meeting, making a dinner reservation, buying 8 pairs of novelty socks, and then searching for the name of that movie. The one with the school bus, the alien, and the actor with the hair who was in that show with the turtle and the barista who used to dance on Broadway. Anyway, the point is, digital connectivity is vital to how we live our lives today. And our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is leading the way with their world-class networks, bringing connectivity to rural and remote parts of the country. Right now, on Quebec's lower North Shore, over 1,000 kilometers east of Quebec City, an area so remote there are no roads. This does not come as news to somebody from Saskatchewan. TELUS is building one of the most remote and innovative network infrastructures in Canada, designed to serve 14 communities and over 5,000 people. All of the equipment needed to complete the project is brought in by helicopter or boat. And residents of the area know this kind of high-speed connectivity will improve outcomes in healthcare and education and empower local business to grow, all while allowing residents to stay connected to their land and culture. Since 2000, TELUS has invested over $40 billion to help connect Canadians across our country's vast and diverse landscape. It's just a fact that, with TELUS, Canadians living in rural areas enjoy access to high network speed and availability that outperforms the overall average speeds of many other countries, including the U.S. To learn more about how TELUS helps us stay all connected for good, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, Herle Burlyites, I'm David Herle. Thank you for listening today. The Herle Burly listenership has been growing steadily these last 6 months, so I just want to say how much we appreciate the support and the comments in social media and your ratings and reviews. It would be an understatement to say I read all of it. Probably more accurate to say I read all of it and then I reread all of it. And then I reread all of it sometimes at 2 a.m. because it makes my obsessive-compulsive heart happy. And Terry can vouch for this. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had this comment from someone identifying themselves as Tie in the Soup. Unmarred by partisan garbage, extremely entertaining and appealing to smart, engaged people who keep one foot in the puddle of beer on the floor. How great is that? Thank you, Tie in the Soup, from a fellow Toe in the Suds. Today on the pod, as you can see if you're watching on YouTube, and yes, you can watch the Herle Burly on the YouTube machine, we're not in our usual swanky days at the Orange Lounge Studios in Toronto. We're in Ottawa, at the Canada 2020 headquarters, where we're delighted to welcome both Keith Boag and Neil Macdonald to the pod. Both of these guys have just retired after long and absolutely stellar careers at the CBC. Keith as Chief Political Correspondent, Neil as Senior Correspondent for The National. I've known and admired them for their intelligence and their perspective for a very long time. Recently, both Keith and Neil spent years working in the United States. They stand witness to the demise of journalism and of American democracy. And today, we're going to talk about both. Keith Boag, Neil Macdonald, welcome to the Herle Burly.
Thank you. Thanks.
Where's the guy that plays that song, that Herle Burly, Herle Burly?
He's my great friend Ray Martini. He wrote that song.
Stays in my head.
Yeah, it's a good earworm.
I walk the dogs, yeah.
Can I just point out, though, that you read that ad and that intro in one take.
Yep.
As somebody who's worked for CBC for 35 years and Neil almost as long, do you know how few CBC broadcasters could do that? No, I'm impressed.
Really? It seems like a minimum skill that you would have.
We're sucking up to you. I was Tie in the Soup that wrote that kiss up email.
Really?
I was trying to get on.
Well, it worked. It worked for you.
Congrats.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming on. You know, I admire you both tremendously, and really think that you have unique and brilliant perspectives. And I want to talk to you about Trump today. And you've both said, "Oh my God, does anybody want to hear more analysis of Trump and all that stuff?" But I really think that the two of you, we haven't heard much informed analysis about the Trump phenomenon from Canadians through Canadian eyes who have observed it develop and happen. That's what I wanted to talk to you guys about a little bit about today, and what I thought you could bring to it. And then, of course, having two journalists who've seen the full cycle of journalism from the 80s to now, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that and where that's going. So let's start with Trump, if we could. Let's go back to basics. What is it about Trump that Americans find appealing?
You want to do that? Go ahead.
Oh man, I mean, so many of them don't, right? I think one of the things that you always have to bear in mind is that he still does not reflect the views or represent half of the country. Like, there's half of the country out there that is absolutely gobsmacked by his election and incensed that he continues to conduct himself in public in the way that he does.
Right.
So, one of the things I hear too often when I come back to Canada is like, what's going on with the United States? And in a way, and without being harsh, it's a little bit in your question too that this is something that's happening across America, and it's not, right? But what Trump did obviously was tap into something that people hadn't been paying enough attention to and exploit it in the way that a good television producer and television star, and he is, whether you like him or not, he knows how to hold the attention of the camera. And that was a big reason why he was able to continue to get the attention that he did in the primary season that essentially legitimized his candidacy and made him a serious political contender when he really shouldn't have been based on his resume. I don't want to wander on too long about this.
No, but I'm just going to say, Keith, he's a little bit more popular. To my eye, it's not encouraging that he doesn't have more than 50% support.
I don't mean it to be
incredibly
encouraging.
discouraging that he has somewhere between 42 and 49, as of yesterday, approval. Like, how can they look at him govern for 3 years and say, I approve?
It's the they, that referring to the United States, that I'm objecting to.
Right,
there are so many Americans that feel exactly as you do, and that feel that he hijacked the election, that he's illegitimate as president, that he's unfit for the office that he holds. There are way more Americans that feel that way than there are, by the numbers, Canadians who feel that way. I mean, they're very, very critical of him, but he happens to have won, the biggest pulpit in the world, the presidency of the United States, and he brings to it that skill of being able to hold the attention of the camera almost indefinitely just by being outrageous. That keeps this thing churning. And, I guess all I'm trying to say is let's not slander all of America because the president of the United States happens to be Donald Trump right now.
Okay, I'll be more precise, Neil. Why do somewhere between 40 and 50% of Americans find Donald Trump appealing?
Oh, I'll go beyond 40 or 50%, actually. I think that Trump is the id of America. And I think it's been something that it finally emerged. And I'm kind of glad that it emerged.
Yeah.
Because we can stop pretending that America has a moral soul and is a moral nation that always tries to do the right thing, which I have in the past been beguiled from time to time into believing. Trump represents not only every goof that ever walked around in an anti-Obama rally with a big poster of Obama with a Hitler mustache and an SS uniform, and believe me, there were plenty of those, or every idiot that showed up with an AK-47 at an Obama rally, which they did, or every fool that showed up in a Starbucks in Reston, Virginia with a Colt 45 strapped to his hip, looking around aggressively, and there's plenty of that. I think that he also represents a much more subcutaneous thing. I have sat at a table with moderate conservatives, moderate Republicans in the States, and most of them disapprove of this kind of behavior. But I suggested at one point that dropping the atomic bomb in the Second World War was a war crime. We were talking about war crimes in the context of the Iraq invasion, and I was putting forth the notion that America commits war crimes. And I almost got thrown out of the house. We do not. We are the most moral army in the existence of the world. Mm. The Americans say that, and the Israelis say that about the IDF. I don't know any other country that actually makes that claim, but they believed it. And furthermore, whereas a lot of Americans are not terribly religious, are not the evangelical Christians that line up slavering behind Donald Trump, try saying at an American dinner table that you're an atheist. Watch what happens. A miasma of discomfort will descend in the proceedings. People look at each other. I've seen it happen because I've done it. And it's better to say you're a Muslim in America than say you're an atheist. What's that? It's the modern day equivalent of saying that you're a communist. So I think that Donald Trump represents something. I'm going to take a flight of poetic fancy here, something rather dark in the American soul. He represents things that people whispered, even polite people whispered to one another at the dinner table and didn't say to their friends. And now they can say it out in the open.
I think there's truth. I think there's truth to that. Just one fact, though: Donald Trump is not and has never been as popular in America as Barack Obama. And I remember in 2008 how people felt about America when they elected Barack Obama. Thought it was a great country.
Yeah,
they thought
that
it
was amazing.
All of those things that Neil says it isn't. And that was just 2008.
Yeah.
And they reelected him in 2012, which they have not yet done with Donald Trump.
So let me take your point.
But
about
nobody
let's
was
not
saying
fire
that.
I think
Nobody
that's
was saying
wise.
in 2008 or 2012 the kind of nonsense that Trump started bleating. And that changed things.
Well,
That
I
somebody
Let's-
would get
let's
up-
narrow-
I covered a little Pat Buchanan too, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay, but
Yeah.
he was
We
marginal.
listen to Pat
But let's
Buchanan.
narrow this down. So, if you look at Trump's approval or support levels by demographics,
Incidentally, I met Pat Buchanan, and I actually know Pat Buchanan, and he's no Donald Trump. Sorry.
smarter presumably.
Yeah, but eons.
So, among the black population, Trump has negligible support. Among the Latino population, he has clear minority support.
He has no support amongst black people. Your neighborhood's a disaster. Gee, I wonder why.
But among white people, he has majority support. And among men, he has majority support. In fact, there's a huge gender gap opening up in the United States in the nature of 25, 30 points on this matter. So take that into account. The odds are that somebody like us, a white man in their 50s, is...
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, a white man in their 50s or early 60s is almost certain to be a Trump supporter. Highly likely to be a Trump supporter. Why is that? What's it about us, white men, that makes us...
What's the most distinguishing factor? It's education now, right?
Okay.
Yep.
That was the determining thing. The thing that stood out in the Trump support was education more than any other thing.
Yeah, he said he loves the poorly educated.
He loves the poorly educated. And the reaction of some liberals was like, like he'd call them all stupid,
Yeah.
which is exactly what he wanted them to say, because clearly just because you're not educated doesn't mean you're stupid, right?
Right.
But I think he's smart enough to press that button. But I think knowing that that is a defining characteristic of a Trump supporter is an important piece of information. That's the key data point.
So you don't think it's race?
Well, clearly race, like when people talk about the poorly educated, or when they talk about working class voters, very often they'll describe them as white working class voters. They don't really mean working class voters. So race absolutely has something to do with it.
Yeah.
How strongly people feel about it is one way to measure that. But the comfort level they have with someone who expresses himself the way that Trump does about race and uses race as a way to push people's buttons to divide people, I think that's the important thing about it.
Stuff they didn't
They're
say.
comfortable
Stuff
with
they
that.
only said whispered at the table until he came along. But you interviewed Tom Frank a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I listened to it. Tom Frank's a pretty smart guy. I loved his book. I particularly liked What's the Matter with Kansas, and the principle.
I particularly like to listen liberal, but yeah.
The message in What's the Matter with, or what the conundrum he was addressing in What's the Matter with Kansas is why so many Americans who have bleak economic futures, or blue collar Americans, vote against their economic interests. And that's a
Perceived
real
economic.
American phenomenon, right? And he posits that it's a bait and switch, that the Republicans promise to do something about prostitution and pornography and prayer in schools and gay rights and all, and then never do anything because their hands are tied by the Constitution. And what they do instead is substitute an economic agenda that just takes a wrecking ball to these people's lives. And I think Frank's probably right. Frank's a Marxist, by the way. But Donald Trump incarnates that. Donald Trump has pulled the greatest bait and switch there is. A Manhattan billionaire who has managed to convince America's underclasses that somehow he's their champion? Seriously? And then you've got to wonder how many chumps there are that buy that. Keith's point about education. I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, home of the NIH, more PhDs per capita than any place else in America. You would spend a long time looking for a Trump supporter amongst any of the middle to late middle-aged men in Bethesda. You just wouldn't find one. It is education, but I don't know. But if you do find one, it's going to be an aging white male who's aggrieved at the loss of privilege or the leakage of privilege.
There's
and he
something
thinks that this
happening
guy
with
is
men.
going to get his privilege back. I mean, honestly.
There was something that I was going to ask you whether it's his character or his policies that are attractive. I mean, and it's the character that's so unattractive to me. The policies are too, but the character is. But yet, I mean, he's hanging in there. Like when Nixon was impeached, Nixon was at 30% approval, and if anything, Trump's approval rating is going up. And I've sensed in the public opinion work I did or looked at prior to the last federal election here in Canada, all the public opinion work I did in Ontario leading up to the last election there, men are angry. Men are angry. Even young men are angry. And there's a real deep-seated conservative movement among young male Canadians. What's going on with men out there? Why are they so angry?
Are we talking about white men here?
Yeah.
Again, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of good books coming out that will explore whether some of the complaints that they have not been allowed to make in public were actually legitimate in a certain context and were not allowed to be heard. And now that we are reaping the consequences of that.
What's an example?
Well, in the United States, affirmative action would be one, right?
Yeah.
So it's not an irrational thing for someone who feels that they have been a victim of affirmative action because they didn't get something they thought they otherwise would have
Right.
had, right? That's not an irrational response. But to treat it as though it isn't part of the conversation, I think we are just learning that there's a consequence to be paid for that, and this is it. So I think that's one example, but I think from that example you can extrapolate how there is a legitimacy to a set of grievances that whether you embrace them, whether you even agree with them is less important than whether they are rational and whether they can be understood in a particular context. I know 25 years ago, I think maybe not quite that much, I was at Berkeley doing a story on affirmative action.
Right.
And that was when the regents at the University of Southern California were going to cut back on affirmative action. And so I found some law students at Bolt Hall, which is their law school, very prestigious, and very diverse crowd. I'll never forget asking this young black woman who was can you understand, though? I asked her, can you understand why the white parents of a white child who had the grades and stuff and wanted to get into this school might feel aggrieved that they couldn't because you were given an advantage that she didn't have? And I just wanted to know whether she understood that. She said, no, she didn't understand that. Well, how can you not understand that?
Right.
That means you can't understand being a parent and having a child, basically.
Right.
But I think that we lived in a culture that supported her point of view, that you don't even have to understand the complaint of the other side.
It's
much
just
less
illegitimate.
agree with it. It's
Yeah.
just illegitimate to discuss this, right? And Trump put everything on the table. You know, whether he called it political correctness or he, had some other name for it, what he did was legitimize a set of grievances that had been simmering below the surface, I think. And I think one of the things that Neil sort of hinted at here that is hugely important is that he allowed people to say what they had been thinking, but felt it was politically incorrect or that they would be
I definitely
shunned
see that in people
if they did say
that
it.
people that are fans of his in Canada. I see how their behavior's changed over 3 years and what they feel prepared to say now that they didn't feel prepared to say.
I think that it's. I don't think it's.
Is that what you mean by the it?
Yes, I think overwhelmingly, it's personality rather than policies. Most of these people, most of his flying monkeys or ditto heads or whatever you want to call them, Rush Limbaugh called his followers ditto heads, couldn't give a damn about his policies and probably don't understand
That's
them.
Congressional Medal of Honor.
Well, I've been to Tea Party rallies, and there's a conversation you can have at a Tea Party rally that goes something like this. What do you want? Smaller government. Okay, so what do you want to cut? You want to cut defense? No, we've got to be strong. Okay, well, do you want to cut Social Security? No, sir. Okay, well, are you crazy? We paid into that. All right, then. Well, what about Medicare? Well, I had one woman say, sir, it might interest you to know that Medicare is not a government program. As Obama said, keep your government hands off my Medicare. And you go down the list. Well, what about Medicaid? Well, no, a lot of them have relatives that are on Medicaid, right, who are indigent. What about unemployment? Well, a lot of them are there because they're unemployed. And you go down this list and you finally say, listen, we've now covered 92% of government spending. Like, what do you want to get rid of? Waste, fraud, and abuse. Yeah. Well, we're gonna get rid of it.
There's small government advocates like Albertans are small government advocates.
Policy doesn't enter into it. What enters into it is this.
That's a little too dismissive.
He pisses off liberals. He drives them crazy. He makes their heads explode. That's what the State of the Union address was about. That's what the political correctness thing is about. Political correctness is really just being polite. Most of what he says is about making liberal heads explode and making his survivors cheer and snicker. They couldn't give a damn. They couldn't name any of the judges he's appointed. I'm not even sure he has coherent policy objectives. Are you?
No.
But I am sure that he's got...
Wait.
All right.
What's wrong with that is that it overlooks the single biggest promise that Donald Trump made in the election campaign and how well that was understood by the people who voted for him. He was going to build a wall.
Yes,
and that became a metaphor
wall.
for all kinds of things that they were able to plug into with Donald Trump.
And how'd that turn out for him?
He became the president of the United States.
Right,
I think it
what
turned
about
out
the
fine.
wall?
So what did the wall
The wall never mattered. That was the thing.
What did it symbolize?
It symbolized that he had what they considered to be the proper attitude to what they considered also to be the number one issue threatening America today, which was immigration of brown people. Right.
Yeah.
That's what the wall was. I don't think he needs to build the wall. I don't. If he really felt the wall was important, he would have built the thing by now. He doesn't. Right. But he understands how powerful a connector that is for him with his base. And I think it's dismissive to say that they didn't pay attention to that. I think it was the thing. Of all of his policy promises, the single most important one was the wall.
Well, let me
suggest something else
It's really interesting because the wall was to liberals, to people who disliked Trump, the wall was the number one point of derision. The wall was the ultimate dismissiveness of him, how stupid he was, Mexico will pay for it, all this stuff.
It also made their heads blow up.
It was the epitome of ridiculousness. And you're saying to another half of the population, it was a powerfully strong symbol.
Well, I went to rallies where people came dressed as the wall, right? and the thing about a Trump rally, I mean, you should go
more imaginative costume than I've ever come up with.
Oh, don't sell yourself short here.
I used to go to rallies where Tea Partiers would show up with tea bags before somebody told them what teabagging was, and then they got mad if you called them a teabagger. But another spoke of that particular wheel that Keith just brought up. There's the wall. What a beautiful clean coal. Coal's coming back. So he goes to Kentucky. Chris Hall went with him, and at the CBC. And people are cheering, and they're overjoyed. He's standing up there saying, coal is coming back. Beautiful, clean coal. Well, it's an oxymoron, but never mind. Coal isn't coming back. Those people have had a steady erosion of their jobs since he took office, and it doesn't matter. I don't know if they understand it or not, but if they do understand it, they're willing to set that salient fact aside so that they can stand and watch him and cheer while he makes liberals' heads blow up.
But at some point we're going to be talking about the media. And one of the things that I will preview now, is that Trump understands as well as anybody, if not better than anybody, how powerful the desire people have is to believe what they want to believe.
Yeah.
And that's what every facet of his campaign, his public rhetoric, keeps that in mind at all times. The truth doesn't matter.
No.
It just simply does not matter.
It may be the most powerful human urge.
To argue with people that coal is yesterday's technology and you will not have a future in it is having a conversation that they're not interested in.
Right.
They're not interested in that conversation.
No.
They're interested in someone who tells them what they want to believe. And you know what? We're all a little bit like that.
No, I'm
not.
We're mostly like that.
I'm not.
I'm mostly like that.
I am mostly like that.
Yeah.
There's no question. Since I started doing this podcast, I have come into contact with enough conservatives to realize how few conservatives I used to come in contact with.
Uh-huh.
And it has made me realize what a sheltered little life I had created for myself, where my social media feed largely reflected my own views, with some exceptions that I would plant in there to give me some jolt of the other side, but largely my social media feeds reflect my own point of view. My circle of friends reflected my own point of view, and so we don't like to be challenged.
Oh no, liberals. If I can just digress for a moment, the federal government's carbon tax here hasn't changed any behavior at all, as far as I can tell. I think the price of a liter of fuel is cheaper today than it was the day after they imposed the tax, and yet they're telling us this is going to change Canadians' behavior. I'm sorry, if it's supposed to be a Pigovian tax, it has failed. And liberals try to sit at a liberal dinner table and say that the carbon tax is a ridiculous failure. You'll be shouted down. You'll be maybe asked to leave, right? It's the same sort of article of faith. People believe what they want to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we'll get into that in the media.
So
and we're
for
going to get
smart
to the
guys like
media
you
really
and me.
quickly. Neil, Keith, we need to take a break for a word from our sponsor. Trust. It's at the heart of every successful relationship, especially when it comes to buying a home. Ontario's realtors are trusted every day to help their clients navigate one of the largest financial transactions of their lives, buying a home. Representing Ontario's 80,000 realtors, the Ontario Real Estate Association is on a mission to increase trust and professionalism in Ontario's real estate industry. That means stronger rules to punish bad behavior, access to modern business tools and better education. The Trust in Real Estate Services Act, or TRESA, delivers on that mission. TRESA is a groundbreaking piece of legislation that will make Ontario a leader in North America when it comes to real estate professionalism and trust. Go to orea.com, OREA.com, to learn more. All right, guys, we're back, and I should mention that there is a bit of a technical glitch that is going to affect sound, the sound quality later on in this podcast, but it should be manageable. I just want to ask you, before we go, to try to give people some hope.
Not possible.
No.
Which Democrat which Democrat will most likely beat him?
Oh, I would love, and this, I would love to see Elizabeth Warren, an educated, brainy, crisp woman of the left, trash him. I'm not sure it can happen. You tend to look at the polls. This is the big conundrum down there. Who can do it? That's the single greatest existential question for the Democrats. I like to think that the soft voters, the non-flying monkeys who have watched this vulgar boor perform the way he has and make America a laughingstock for the last 4 years, would vote for any of those people.
Stunning to me, this is a consideration, because as far as I'm concerned, we could walk up and down O'Connor Street here, and anybody we found would be better than him. But
well, okay, but
that's a should question though, rather than a could question, right?
Right. Sorry, that is. So, who do you think could win?
Well, the two most recent big elections are 2016 and 2018, right? Mm-hmm. Which one do you think 2020 is going to be most like? Is it going to be more like 2020 or more like 2016? I think it's going to be more like 2020. I think you're going to see it.
More like 2018, sir?
2018, sorry.
Yeah.
You're right. It's going to be more like 2018, where you saw a huge turnout. And when the base turns out from both parties, as it did in 2018, Democrats win that one. So that's kind of a way of saying, I think, that...
Did they win it in enough of the electoral college states to make a difference, though?
Well, I mean...
Tell me.
But you don't think one candidate
nobody
matters?
can tell you that.
You don't think one candidate matters more than the other?
I don't think if you ran every candidate and they all won, they would win by the same margin. So yes, I think it will make a difference. And I'm not at a place where I think anybody can win. But I think the other lesson of 2018 is that they ran on a message that appealed to moderates, right? And they won swing states, sometimes by narrow margins. AOC, as much as you might like her, was not in a tough battle after she won the primary in the Bronx. She was not in a tough battle in the 2018 midterm elections, right? And I think that this is the thing they have to be careful of, that Democrats need to understand why they won in 2018, why they were able to mobilize people and get them out to the polls and create the biggest Democratic landslide since 1974. And it wasn't by experimenting
if I was a Democrat
with the left and progressive voters. It wasn't.
Right.
If I was a Democrat,
David Frum recently, was it Frum or Chait? Jonathan Chait.
Frum.
If I were a Democrat and I saw Donald Trump targeting Joe Biden the way he's targeting Joe Biden, I would expect there's a reason for that, and I would probably vote for Joe Biden for the leadership.
Yeah, I just think Biden is a terrible
candidate.
Yeah, okay. But right now Trump seems obsessed with Bloomberg. So
right.
I mean, essentially,
Bloomberg hit him where it hurts.
With
that comment about who's the other one.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That hit him where it hurts.
And also, Trump likes to portray himself as one of the wealthiest men in America. Bloomberg actually is.
But that's what I'm saying. Bloomberg was asked, what about a race between two billionaires? And Bloomberg said, who's the other one?
Right, But I don't, like the Biden people are peddling this line, he's attacking us because we know I'm the one who can beat him. It's not true. He's attacking him because he expects he's going to be the nominee, which is not the same thing at all. And I think he is nervous about Bloomberg. Whether he should be or not, I mean, I think that'd be an interesting discussion to have with someone who has the background that you have. But it wouldn't matter who it was. If they're at the top of the Democratic pile, he's going to attack them the way that he's attacking Biden. It's not because he thinks he's the winner. It's because he thinks he's most likely the winner.
Weren't there polls about 6 months ago when all this Biden uproar started that indicated that Biden would beat Trump in almost all of the swing states?
But that's
true of all the candidates. They've all had that polling at some point.
The polls I look at generally show that with all the candidates, those states remain close, very, very close, right? A couple of percentage points differentiate. So he could still run all those states against any of the candidates conceivably. The last question on American politics before we switch to journalism really riffs off of what you were just saying, which is the Democrats appear to have split into almost two parties now. One of which is the what you talked about, the 2018 strategy. The people that Tom Frank attacked in the book Listen Liberal, right, are one side of that party, and the people that that are disciples of Tom Frank are the other side of that party. The people who say, I don't want to go back to the status quo ante before Trump. That was lousy too. We need something entirely different, right? It's not clear to me that any candidate is going to be able to deliver the Democratic vote as we understand it in this election.
Would Trump not be the catalyst that would make them rally enthusiastically behind any winner?
Well, there's some argument that the Sanders people are as attracted to Trump as they are to another Democrat because they're disruptors, right?
Yeah.
Not all of them. I mean,
no, that's right.
Not even a majority of them, but a significant minority of them think that both of them are on the right track. Disrupt, turn it over. It all sucks.
Yeah. Do you worry that the split in the Democrats hands it to Trump?
Well,
I worry that they'll cock everything up. I mean,
that's another way of putting it, isn't it? I mean, yeah.
They'll cock everything up. Okay, let's switch to an equally happy topic, which is what appears to be.
Can you imagine? I'm sorry, I'm stuck on that question. But did you imagine they would have messed it up as much as they have this early? They've got a list of frontrunners that is distinguished by the fact that it's white and mostly aged. Right? In their first caucus, their first test, they screw it up so badly that the Buttigieg they create this dynamic where the guy who wins loses.
Yeah,
most,
exactly.
Right. How do we get here? Can't anybody play this game?
Nobody's going to want to mention that they won Iowa.
Well, certainly it's a really interesting thing for anybody who built their camp. Well, now they all did build their campaign around the assumption that a win in Iowa vaults you right into a great place in New Hampshire and all that. That's all gone. So every campaign will have had their basic assumptions thrown up in the air by this Iowa debacle.
I suppose I suppose what it is within the Democratic Party. You talked about Frank's thesis. That's a riff on Lenin saying the true class enemy were the Social Democrats, right? Were the compromisers.
In the University of Regina Political Science Department, they used to tell me they were coming for me first.
Every Democratic podcast in the States, if you listen to them, is hung up on this very topic, right? Do we go with the desperate desire in our hearts for change and real social justice, or do we do what's pragmatic and necessary? And I suspect, I don't know. I didn't think at the start of 2008 that Barack Obama would be the president, and I didn't think that Donald Trump would be president. So it may have been all topsy-turvy, but I trust the American people to trust the American people to lean towards, I suspect, tradition. There.
Interesting.
What does that mean?
It means that the Americans are not terribly eager to embrace real change, and Bernie Sanders is going to be real change. So is Elizabeth Warren, by the way.
Yeah, I don't think Sanders has faced anything like the
Joe
attacks.
Biden voted against busing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
But they elected Donald Trump. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
They want to turn something over. Anyway, I'm sorry.
So linked issue, journalism, which is we are very close to a world that has only a few major newspapers. Only a few newspapers, not major, only a few newspapers in it. We're just years away from that world. And
publisher of the Toronto Star said a few years ago, the end is in sight in Walrus magazine. So it might not be years, it might be months.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, the Star's out of cash. Star's out of cash by everything that you can tell. TV news audiences are way down. What was the audience of the National when either of you first appeared on it?
Well, when I joined, it was Nielsen at the time, not people meters, which were very disruptive. But when they found out how many people were really watching, they got really upset. But we were told 1.4 million in 1988, weren't we?
Geez, I can't remember, but it was a number much more like that than
300,000,
600,000 or 700,000 even.
Which they would be lucky to get now, right?
But we went through this period where, like, when the people meters that Neil mentioned came on, you know, the executive producer of the show would go through last night's lineup and look at them per minute viewers and match the stories to how many viewers you got, and your career depended on that. And I'm thinking, like, this can't possibly be public broadcasting, right? Like, isn't this the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing?
Well, officially in public broadcasting, the audience doesn't matter. But let me tell you, you know, the opposite is true. What Keith is talking about is a guy named John Owen, who I think probably hired both of us. And when those people meters came along, he would look at the numbers and go nuts. Actually, you know that, well, Peter, blah, blah, Peter, blah, Peter, we call it? Mm-hmm. It's you're doing a stand-up and then you pretend to talk back to him, and it's all, you're actually talking to a blank camera, and then they sew it all together.
Really? I didn't know that. That's fraud.
Oh, so there are small frauds in television, David. I'll tell you all about it later on at lunch if you want to know. But,
you know, there's more than 22 minutes of news every day, and sometimes less.
That Peter stuff started because of the people meters. I actually did the first Peter in the Ottawa newsroom, and people had to learn how to, you know, to do a Peter because John was convinced that if we were just more conversational, more people would watch. Right. I think probably people have been lying to Nielsen, but anyway,
I think that's true.
Anyway,
so you're saying not that many people ever watch the news? Because I was going to say, so if TV news is way down and newspapers, which used to be in every household in the city, are now disappearing altogether, do you have any idea where people are getting their information?
Are they after information? I mean, this is I think particularly a question for the National, CBC National, which, you know, to its great credit, I think in many, many ways, in the early 1980s, took the great risk of plopping itself into the primetime schedule, where it continues to this day. But if you're in the primetime schedule, you're facing an audience that very largely is not interested in information. Right. You know, it's interested in Seinfeld, it's interested in hour-long American TV dramas. And if that's our competition, we're going to lose, and we did. But I think, you know, that was a time when the CBC could, on principle, decide for itself that you needed to have an information programming alternative in the primetime schedule. But it's also been the toughest thing that we've ever been up against. And it has made us much more, I'm still doing the us, made the CBC and the National much more conscious of the eyeballs it's collecting than probably it would be at 11 o'clock, or that it ever should have been in the eyes of the people who created the public broadcaster.
They're doing a renewal now. I guess probably there were 15 or 20 renewals during my time there. There was always a renewal going on. I think Keith was dragged into one of the renewal committees. And it always ended up as, we'll make some cosmetic changes, right? And they in my opinion, they never probed as to why we were shedding audience. There's some avoidance going on here. I think that if you want to know what I think we are.
This is exactly why you're on the podcast.
I think we were too didactic. I think during Meech Lake, for example, Mordecai Richler wrote in O Canada, O Quebec that Peter Mansbridge would come on TV and say, bad news tonight on the Meech Lake front. You know, there was a failure in the Newfoundland legislature and in Manitoba. And he said, did it ever occur to the producers of the National that is good news to a lot of Canadians? I know a few people of goodwill who believed that thing should have failed. But the National decided it was good for the country. We tend to do that. And we get preachy, and we talk down to people, and we talk to them as though they're all living in Cabbagetown. And I think that's cost us. Again, I'm doing the same thing as Keith. I think it's cost the National over the years. There's no reason, with the resources the CBC has and they outstrip everybody's now. CBC is becoming the only legitimate media giant in the country. The Toronto Star, for Christ's sake, its market capitalization, I checked yesterday, was about $30 million. You can buy an apartment for that in Toronto.
Well, the power of the CBC is really shown
nice.
online now, more than on television in terms of its
in North York, pretty nice one in North York. Sorry, what did you say?
I said the power of the CBC is mostly shown online now, and it's online reach rather than on television.
That was one of the smartest decisions they made in the last 20 years, was getting into was seeing it coming and doing it.
Yeah.
Whether they should have done it, you got to feel for the Toronto Star or the Globe and Mail, who are suffering and shedding staff and making endless compressions to be competing with a subsidized organization on the same rink. I don't know whether the CBC should have been doing it or not. There's a tortured argument that can be made that the CBC should, I know, and God knows I benefited from it.
So with great trepidation in front of two journalists, I say that I don't really buy the argument. I think it's fair and reasonable and good for the CBC and every other journalistic organization to examine itself and see ways in which it can improve and serve its audience better. But I don't think that journalism is dying, mainstream media is dying because of the quality the product deserved to die. I think it's dying because the economics of it the slats have been kicked out from under it.
Is that right? So then the New York Times is dead and the Washington Post is dead and the Wall Street Journal is dead?
No, but they're
profitable.
They are unique circumstances.
In that they convey information that's a must-read. Correct?
Well, they have different business models, right?
Yeah, but it ultimately boils down to content.
Well, first of all, I don't know if the Washington Post is making money.
It is.
It is?
Mm-hmm. They monetize their online operation.
New York Times is making money, but those, and maybe for the same reasons, maybe the Globe would survive as the paper of record. But no daily, and even
I don't know
hugely
if there's a must-read in
prestigious
Canada,
dailies like
David.
the Miami Herald, the Boston Herald, these things are done.
I don't know if there's a must-read in Canada. I'll
There
tell
may
you,
not be.
I sit down in the morning and I read the BBC and I read The Economist, I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, and I read the Wall Street Journal. And from time to time, the Financial Times, but the Canadian papers are low on my list. Sorry, they are.
So
I need to know this other information.
To complete my question, it is, if that's true, that it is the economics. For instance, I had mentioned this to you on the phone the other day when we were talking. I had no idea how much newspapers relied on the revenue from classified ads. Which was
in the past, yeah.
in the past, which was completely wiped out
Yeah,
By Craigslist.
by Craigslist or whatever the internet does. So that has nothing to do with the quality of their reporting. That's just a fundamental change in their economics. So if that's true, what's wrong with subsidizing media news organizations?
Well, I mean, the top line thing is who's doing the subsidy, and doesn't that make them beholden to that agency?
Yes,
because we're
exactly.
talking about government, right?
Right. Okay.
And journalists,
But nobody would be
even
more
CBC
qualified than you to tell us whether journalists are going to feel beholden to their subsidizers.
Well, because of the CBC, my experience there, I don't think we ever did. I remember being on a panel when I was the Ottawa Bureau Chief on television and being, asked about this. And I said, in all my time as Ottawa Bureau Chief, I can honestly say that I have never felt any pressure from CBC that was politically directed. And Trina McQueen was there, who had been a very senior executive vice president, I think, of the CBC. And she sort of piped up, well, I can tell you the pressure's there all the time. And we haven't. And I was thinking, well, that's my point.
Precisely.
That's exactly how it's supposed to work.
Right.
So
management feels that the reporters don't.
Well, you need a structure that insulates you from that, and it's possible to build that. That's all. I guess that's my long-winded way of saying it's possible to build a structure that insulates you from the political pressures that are applied at the top of the
And
organization.
those political
I
pressures
saw
presumably are
CBC
complaints, not directives.
I saw
Government never should
CBC
have
crack
directed.
under pressure, but not pressure from the Liberal Party, or not pressure from. I saw CBC crack under the pressure of its own perceptions. They were afraid of certain political lobbies that advocated for certain causes.
I was asked by the Conservative Party at one point going into an election. This is after I was bureau chief, incidentally, I think, to take one or two reporters off their plane.
Yeah,
That was a direct sort of, we don't want this person on our plane. Which I don't understand how they could walk into my office and say that without my response reflexively being, because you said that, I can't do it.
Right.
but at the same time, there was something called the Red Circle policy. I was part of the genesis of the Red Circle policy because of my Israel coverage. And the powers that be decided that no story mentioning the word Israel could go to air without it being seen by management, before it being seen by senior editors and Red Circle. That was later extended to the Conservative Party of Canada because of a perception that the Ottawa Bureau had made some mismoves with respect to the Conservatives. So when the editor-in-chief announced this, I said, what are we doing here? We're giving special treatment? No, we're just being more prudent. Oh, okay, so there are varying levels of prudence. So we're going to be this prudent with these guys and this prudent with these guys. Is there a red circle where if I report on Lebanon? No, so I can say whatever. I can say more about Lebanon. Well, no, not necessarily. It was just gobbledygook. The fact is that we buckled and we cracked because of not necessarily pressure from the Conservative Party, but from conservatives and from our own audience. And public broadcaster has to be acutely aware of these things. And there was fear. Sorry, there was.
So, how much do you think we should be concerned about perception over reality? Because a great deal of the concern about this is simply the perception that you will be seen to be beholden, and that will directly affect your credibility in the marketplace, right? You can't afford the perception.
Well, see, this is where we're in our silos, because I would sit here and I would say, well, I don't think that's going to matter because the CBC's been subsidized, and I've never heard, nobody I know has ever questioned the CBC's reporting. But of course, you could have a conservative sitting here who would say, well, that's exactly the point, because the CBC is a liberal organization because it's funded by the government. So, I mean, I think you got to do. I think you got to do.
It's not a liberal organization. It's an organization of the status quo.
Does it have a liberal bias? A small L liberal bias?
Yes, I think
it does
yes.
in its decision about what the reality is
on social issues.
Right.
On social issues.
Well, I mean, what's important? That's the key editorial decision in any newsroom every day is what's news. What are we covering today? And I think our tendency is to cover a certain range of issues to the expense of others because there's only, on broadcast, there's only so much time you can devote to these things and so on. But I think people have had legitimate complaints about how we cover economics. Economics is a pretty important thing and vital to everybody's day-to-day existence, right? But I have, as long as I've been at CBC, been told by people that your coverage of economics is left wing. It's got a liberal bias to it.
I'm not even sure about that. I think it's just yes, I do. I mean, take aside a bunch of reporters, even elite reporters, and ask them the difference between monetary and fiscal policy, and then call me when you get the first right answer.
Right.
Try that. Watch what happens. Do you think that there's a bias at CBC with respect to coverage of monetary policy? Probably not, because most people don't understand it.
Right.
It's an incredibly powerful force, especially in the last 10 years of quantitative easing and money printing. But have you seen much coverage of it in the mainstream media? And this isn't just CBC. Most reporters get into journalism because they don't like mathematics. And they don't like Sorry. And it reflects in their coverage. They want to cover the low-hanging fruit. They want to cover, LGBT rights and which bathroom transgender people should use. Sorry. I'm sure that's important. Monetary policy is probably a bit more important. I would say the coverage is weighted, and it's weighted by ignorance.
Ellie Elboy, our mutual friend, told me that was the most important function of news, was to tell people what to think about, not to tell them what to think, but to tell them what was important to be thinking about.
That's a view.
Not yours?
Well, I got plunked down in the Middle East. An awful lot of stories going on in the Middle East. I had to decide which stories to tell. I had to decide which, because the desk isn't going to tell me. I'm on the ground. And eventually I realized the story is what I say the story is. And I decided that probably Canada is a small, liberal country, pluralistic, democratic society that wants to see its own values mirrored back at it. And I have to cover what's going on here through that lens. That was my decision on that. But yeah, I decided what to write. And the same thing goes in the States to a lesser degree. Go ahead. Sorry.
If I understood Richard Sturzberg correctly when he was the executive vice president of CBC, our first priority and obligation was to be listened to and to be read and to be heard. That if you weren't listened to, read, heard, what the hell were you doing in the business, right? And that seems like a simple truth, but it leads to a whole different perspective on what the day's events are, the newsworthiness of the day's events that are thrown into, right? It explains also why things like economics are not covered in mainstream media, popular media, in a way that they would be if we could be safely guided by Ellie's prescription for what we need, which is not I dare not criticize Ellie, of course, because he's done a lot more thinking about everything before he gets out of bed than I have in my whole life. But I mean, it's a pretty tough thing to argue with. If nobody's paying attention to what you're saying, it doesn't matter that you're saying it. And so that leads to a whole string of things about, what's valued in a reporter. What's valued in a reporter is being read, being able to tell a story, writing skills, performance skills. Those are the things, whether you're in print or in radio or in television, that will carry you a lot further than talking in censorial tones about what's important to people. You have to have something that's a hook to get people.
Well, Sturzberg said that. Sturzberg said that in a different context, so I don't want to judge him on that. But I would take issue with that in the current context, because I think what we're most going to need are facts and truth.
Yes, that's true.
As opposed to opinion, and who's going to be collecting that? And
as opposed to received wisdom.
And I think it has to be the CBC. And I don't care if nobody wants to watch that.
Yeah.
It exists.
Okay, but I don't know. Like, don't you have to care if nobody wants to watch it? Because what's the point?
Well, what's the point of news that isn't truth or factual?
It's a tough pressure, isn't it? This, I think, is the problem of having a public broadcaster funded the way ours is funded, by the way, where we are beholden to the marketplace, but we're also, driven to an increasingly smaller majority of our financing comes from the government.
Right.
But we are chasing eyeballs. There's no doubt about that. We're chasing eyeballs and clicks,
and we're losing,
and failing,
failing.
I think we're doing okay.
But the online thing, not on TV, but the online thing, right, which is much more content driven, right, has all the things you're saying that the
I got bigger audiences for columns than the National did some nights. I mean, with the resources they have. Look, I'll say this: there was a time when big media organizations had a monopoly. They didn't have much competition from social media. They had lots of power, and they could afford little conceits like passing on received knowledge as though it was original knowledge, or saying things going on air with things that are self-evident and parading them as some sort of insight. Happened all the time. The idea was to sound and look important rather than actually say something important. They no longer have that margin of, they no longer have that room. They're talking to an audience that has all sorts of research tools available to it, and Twitter debunks things in a split second. And if you get up and parade around saying things like, as long as the violence continues, more people are bound to be hurt, or only time will tell, people aren't going to listen to you. Right? And we fight the last war, and we're very slow to change.
I think the answer, though, is that you need to be accomplishing what Ellie wants you to accomplish in terms of information, while at the same time doing what Sturzberg wants you to do, which is engaging an audience for it, right? And in a way, that demands a skill that as journalists, we want that skill rewarded. We like to think we're good at that. That is what makes us. That's not only what makes us special, that separates us from someone's Twitter timeline, right? That you want more than just the facts and the information that you can get faster than you've ever been able to get it before. You want it provided in a narrative form with context and style that makes it, dare I say, entertainment, but makes it something that you want to read, not just for the content.
But in the Trump conversation,
what's happening is, I had a friend who's a producer who was brought to Toronto and read into some of the secret meetings that took place in the invention of the new National after Peter departed. And one of the executives got up at a whiteboard and said, one of the things we have to do is we have to lead important social conversations in this country. And this friend of mine said, why don't we just cover them? And everybody stared at that person like they were just not on board. That said a lot.
Right.
What do you mean? What is this leading national discussions nonsense? We are not experts. We are simply reporters. the experts lead the national conversation, or our elected representatives in whom we placed our trust. I'm pretty interested in what Chris Reagan's got to say about carbon tax. I'm not terribly interested to hear what the whole panoply of cable talkers has to say about it. Sorry.
Oh, that's a cancer. Although I'm one of them. From time to time, those panels are, just destroying newspapers.
I don't watch them.
So we talked in the Trump thing about this core basic human desire to have your existing views reinforced rather than challenged. And that's where Sturgeberg's thing runs straight into it. Because in my mind, the National ought to be telling conservative viewers that climate change is real and that the carbon tax is one of the most effective ways to combat it, and it ought to be telling me that a $30 carbon tax isn't doing anything to fight climate change at all, and that carbon tax needs to be $200 or $300 if it's going to actually make a difference in behavior and change carbon tax. That's an uncomfortable truth for me that I don't want to hear, and I like to swim in my social media circles where everybody says liberals are great on the environment, right? I need to hear the opposite. Other people need to hear the opposite. I'm not probably going to seek that out. But isn't it important that it's out there and being said and still exists?
There are orthodoxies that are not challenged and some orthodoxies that are unchallengeable. Nat Hentoff, who was the great First Amendment writer in the United States, used to say that, used to talk about herds of independent thinkers. That's the closest and most accurate characterization of the mainstream media that I've ever heard. Well, what that means is that all those people sitting in the room that are going to lead the discussion on important social issues are going to lead it in one direction. There are certain they're willing to be very courageous and challenge and stick it to the man as long as they do it within a very neatly accepted box. Thinking outside that box is not welcome at the CBC, frankly, or at many other institutions, unless it is. On diversity, we've decided now that is something that we should stick up for, and we probably should. But, there wasn't much of that 15 years ago. We're slow to change. We're very conservative. Let me put it another way. Noam Chomsky said that the media regards itself as the watchdog of the establishment, whereas it is better described as the guard dog of the establishment. We treasure the status quo, and we genuflect to authority. And anybody who doesn't think so doesn't know much about how the mainstream media operates. And I don't think that that's a model for going into this millennium or this social media age. I think it spells doom. I further think that we probably should have some sort of peer regulation for the sake of our own bloody credibility.
Why aren't they credentialed? Why aren't journalists credentialed?
Because we have no respect for one another.
A self-governing body?
Because Keith Boag is never going to stand for Neil Macdonald telling him how he should do it.
I mean, in essence, that's
arrogant bastard.
You're always going to have people who are going to be on the outside of that and criticizing it for just being the club, right? And I'm not convinced that it doesn't become that, even if it doesn't start out that way, right? But journalism and speech they're all about the freedom to hear things you don't want to hear.
Right.
But it's very difficult not to fall to the temptation of saying, yeah, but it's not just that I don't want to hear it, it's because of other things, and suppress information. Anyway, I think that's probably the fear. I don't think that I don't think any critic just starts with it's a bad idea. It's always a slippery slope idea, and I think the arguments.
You want to hear an example? During the Charlie Hebdo shootings, we decided, as did a lot of media organizations, that we were not going to show any of the Charlie Hebdo covers because they were insulting to Muslims. They depicted Mohammed. And in the minds of the mainstream media, particularly at CBC, any depiction of Mohammed was an insult to Muslims. It's nonsense. I've been in all sorts of Shia Muslim homes where there are pictures of Mohammed. It's a Sunni thing and it's a tradition. It's not dictated by the Quran or the Hadith. In any case, we decided this. And then after the shootings, don't forget, an extremist walked in and mowed down a bunch of journalists. The reply was a cover of Muhammad weeping. Now, can you think of any more poignant and suitable and appropriate response to that attack than a cartoon of the Prophet weeping? That was it. We wouldn't run it. Absolutely not. We're not going to do that, Neil. And, the big boss at the time said, "Could you imagine if there was people making these cartoons and denigrating Jesus Christ?" I said, "Well, I went to the Life of Brian. There was guys singing on the cross at the end of it. No one was beheaded outside. The fact is that we internalized this idea that, well, we shouldn't be insulting Islam. Well, we shouldn't be insulting Islam any more than we insult any other religion, but that was an appropriate response, and it was censorship to say we shouldn't have shown that picture. And by the way, it plays into the hands of right-wing conspiracy theories about us all being terrorist lovers. But it was a foolish decision, as was the decision not to show the face or any of the words of the shooter at Virginia Tech in the States. Everybody praised the decision, then went and watched it on some other network. The fact is we don't get to play God. We have a responsibility that we are all too willing to abdicate if we think we're going to offend some of our constituencies or what we perceive as our constituencies.
Okay. With all those flaws understood, this all feels to me like it leads to a fairly dystopian future. Like if there's no edited journalism, and other than in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the CBC, but generally there's no edited journalism. And most people don't get their information from those sources, and there's no agreed upon set of facts around which one can form opinions or policies. Democracy can't function that way.
Correct.
So what's the fix to that?
Well, I think that is the question. Two things. One, I hesitate to draw too many comparisons between Canadian media and U.S. media. The problems of Canadian media are distinct from the problems of U.S. media, at least in terms of some of the things we've been talking about, whether they have found viable business models to adjust to the new reality in Canada. In the United States, clearly some have and some haven't, but there are models out there, and it's not just a lot. I mean, Bloomberg, I think, is probably the most successful business model for a media giant.
These are organizations that sound to me, I don't have data, sound to me like they appeal to a very elite upper crust of society.
Well, I think that the appeal that they have to an individual underestimates the influence that they have because of their ability to influence other media downstream from them, right? But the other thing is that we do not in Canada yet have this isolated conservative media feedback loop that is a cancer on the democracy of the United States, which has created the epistemic crisis that they are now facing, and that if we're not careful, we will face as well. And by that, I mean obviously the attack on truth, on reality, the sense that there are two different realities in the United States, when in fact there's only one reality, and the other is a fantasy that is promoted by at the center Fox News, and then a bunch of very influential freelancers essentially on social media who have no trust points. They have no, they don't have ombudsman, they don't have letters to the editor, they don't publish corrections, they don't do anything that has been established as a way for mainstream media to prove it's accountable to the audience, and that it still obeys a kind of Enlightenment era standard for what journalism should be: a search for truth, detachment, independence, all of those things. That's happening and again, let's not divide it between left and right. This is not a left and right issue. It is just the right that has this problem.
MSNBC is not the equivalent of Fox
News.
No.
Correct. And this is now, this has gone beyond just, we can see this with our own eyes. There's now academic research that backs this up. The lifespan of a fantasy story in the right-wing media loop is infinity. They're still talking about Pizzagate over there.
Yeah.
Whereas the lifespan of fake news in the mainstream media is exactly as long as it takes to prove it or to debunk it, right? These are completely different standards. These are different worlds. We don't want to enter that world in Canada because we can see what it's doing in the United States, where people now believe that, the most important issues facing the American public are what Breitbart tells them are the most important issues. And Breitbart is clearly not interested in journalism. It's not interested in covering what's happening in the United States. It is quite explicitly pushing buttons to manipulate people into supporting ever, into supporting what we might loosely now call Trumpism, if you will.
There is a natural selection going on in the newspaper world, and to a certain extent in the broadcast world, and I don't know what's going to come out the end of it, but I suspect I do. The must-reads will remain standing. The ones that you must read if you have any kind of position of influence or wealth, or that you must sit down and read in the morning. I know what they are to me. I don't know if Canada's got one. And furthermore, Canada is a small and artificially self-contained market in which protectionism, that has rested on pillars of protectionism ever since Confederation. When Barack Obama got up in the Commons and said, "Canada has no protectionism is not the way," I just about choked in my car. Who wrote that? But, I don't know. The Star is a zombie company. The post-media papers are being sucked dry by a hedge fund in New York.
The
Globe is a billionaire's plaything, and its finances are opaque, so we don't know. But none of them is healthy. I don't know if there's a must-read Canadian outlet, because we are so small and because the Americans have no particular interest in reading a Canadian outlet. But probably, you can see where it's going. I believe 109 newspaper jobs were created by government funding in the last year, and there are bids for another 100 plus. There's this fund that the Liberals have established.
Can I just get a quick answer for you, from both of you? Is that a good idea?
Not a chance.
Yes or no?
I think it's
At least start with yes or no.
In a right-thinking world, no. But I mean, in
this world in which we live.
Well, I don't think it's a good idea for all the same reasons Keith said, for heaven's sake. I mean, does anybody think it's a good idea for the government to create journalism?
I think it's a better idea than the counterfactual.
Well, precisely. Yeah, so it's not a matter of good or bad, it's a matter of bad or worse.
Right.
It's becoming fairly clear. These companies that were swashbuckling, rugged individuals, get the government off our backs, stay away from us. I remember during the free trade debate in '88, the government was going to include journalists in the FTA. And, you could go and work across borders depending on what your qualifications were. How dare you? You don't get to say what a journalist is. So John Crosby got up and said, "All right, we've removed the dead hand of the state from your profession. You can stay here." Right? So we were independent. Not so much anymore. And I guarantee you there wouldn't be that discussion now. Remember Sheila Copps got up during that episode and said, "Peter Mansbridge never finished high school." I can't imagine Mansbridge was very happy about that. I never finished high school either, by the way. So I can say that.
I did. I finished.
No, I've given up.
I don't know what the answer to that is, because I don't know. I don't pretend to know even half the details about it. But I will say this: how is it that Postmedia is owned by a hedge fund company? And who allowed that to happen? And wasn't it the government? And if the government allowed that to happen, did it not contribute to the problem? And if it helped to make the problem, should it not help to make the solution as well? I'm not sure this is the right way, but I think that at least some of the problem facing Canadian media is not just, well, we're in a whole new world of technology and so on. Some of it, I think, we sold out our media.
Well, if a company's wallowing in debt and the only person willing to buy the debt is a hedge fund in New York, I guess the alternative is, I guess the government could buy it the same way it buys pipelines, but you've got the same end result, right?
I don't know if you do. I don't know. I mean, hedge funds are a particular type of owner.
Yes, right? They are.
They bleed you dry and throw you away once.
I'm surprised those newspapers are still around at all. It's amazing that any of them is still around.
Well, there must be of some utility still to the hedge fund owners in terms of paying, paying interest costs.
They're draining them at 10%, apparently.
Yeah. So we're going to have to wrap up here pretty shortly. I want to ask you, in the context of this conversation that we've been having, which I've loved, having lived in the States for the number of years that you have, and thought about politics and lived in the culture there, what for you are the most important defining differences between the two countries?
Oh, I think, honestly, it is the one that everybody seems to be aware of when they're talking about the differences between the countries. And however you might describe it, we have, I think, a greater pride and respect for government and what it does in our lives than they do in the United States. Government has been turned into an enemy there, whether that began with Reagan, I think you could make that argument, or earlier or later. It doesn't really matter. But the attitude towards government is hostility in the United States in many areas, to an extent that I don't see in very many areas in Canada.
Okay. Yeah.
They do a lot of things right. I really enjoyed my time down there. The big differences that I think most Canadians don't understand is religiosity. By any set of markers, the Americans are far more religious than Canadians. Pew, I think, had them as the second most religious country in the world.
More Christian or more religious?
More religious. More religious by, as measured by going to a place of worship once a week. In the 1997 or 98, or no, in 2007, 2008, I think it was, Pew named the United States the second most religious country in the world. What was the first, do you think?
No idea.
I thought it would be Saudi or Ireland. But they're very, very religious, and they've got evangelical Christianity, which is a whole different ballgame. I mean, when we talk about how the United States is a secular church and state, division of church and state country, as opposed to these damn, theocracies of the Middle East. Did you see that picture of Trump standing there with his eyes closed in the Oval Office and all the evangelicals laying hands on him? Mm-hmm. It was spooky. Mm-hmm. So there's that. And there's also, Keith puts it as they have less trust in government than we do. I sort of flip that around. They have a near religious reverence for free market, for markets. They think that markets are the wisdom of the marketplace, the wisdom of the free market. The untrammeled free market is a self-evident good. This is even after 2008. Right. Just about these markets just about destroyed the world's economy.
More fundamentally, it's even after slavery.
Right? Yes. Yeah. And what did they do after 2008? They banks deployed an army of lobbyists that proceeded to gut Dodd-Frank. And went right back to the status quo. My guess is they'll be peddling collateralized debt obligations again sooner or later. And it's because, people are brought up in that place to believe that anybody can be prime minister, or president, which is bullshit. As long as you work hard, you will rise and do well, which is bullshit. And that capitalism is a self-evident good, and the markets have wisdom, which is bullshit. But it is a foundational myth in that country. They have very strong foundational myths, and we don't have any. I'd prefer not to have any, frankly. I love that meme where it shows the flag, and it's an attack on Trump, but it says, if you don't stand for the special song, then the magic sky cloth won't freedom. That's them. That wouldn't work up here, right? So that's the difference. And in a sense, it's all about however you define religion. They are a much more religious place. Their beliefs are near religious.
I think Neil's point about foundational myths is extremely good. I think we're largely unaware of such a thing until we get there. Even if we visit there frequently, when you live there, you know that you can't.
They really believe it.
They do.
We've had,
I don't know.
But we would be kind of cynical about it up here. We'd be kind of, if we tried to have one of those, we wouldn't really buy into it.
If you're a leader of the free world, is that like a natural consequence of that self-image to begin with, and then you work backwards from there? Well, how did we get here? And there are a lot of embarrassing things to have to face up to if you want the truth about that. Better to have a myth, right? And fundamentally, America doesn't want to face up to its racist past. So many of these things can be traced back to that, and religion is a nice refuge for that as well. They don't have to be accountable to it.
Myths are societal glue, and they tend to hold things together to a certain extent, and they can be useful in that. We've had things. Look, most Canadians don't know this story, maybe you do, that about the POWs, the Canadians captured in World War II. The Germans, because of the Vichy regime, told the French Canadian POWs they didn't have to participate in the forced marches to Buchenwald. But they said, no, we're going to. And they marched with their captured English Canadian colleagues on the same level as POWs. They didn't have to. That, to me, could have been turned by a clever spinmeister like David Herle into a national myth, into a foundational myth.
Sounds more like a job for Anthony Wilson-Smith, who does listen to the podcast from time to time. So,
well, it's a good one, Yeah,
it is a very good one.
But we don't have them.
So I'm super pessimistic these days. And to try to prevent myself from just sitting around and waiting for the apocalypse, starting to end these podcasts by asking people to
sing.
give me a reason for optimism. What's a reason to be optimistic right now?
Defined benefit pensions.
That's a fairly specific, narrow reason.
Look, most people that I know, have been instilled to a certain degree with a sense of right and wrong, and even those coups that show up with AK-47s, if you talk to them one-on-one, you'll very quickly find you're speaking to an otherwise decent person who just has an obsession with guns or has been told that Obama's a Nazi. The evangelical Christians are welcoming decent people one-on-one. It's when they get together, right? So you sort of, I guess, if I have any hope for, if I have any reason for optimism at all, it's, that we don't have religious sectarian strife that is tearing the country to pieces. I lived in the Middle East, so I've got a different litmus test. But that we have, that a lot of people in the end are prepared to do the right thing, and a lot of Republicans, a lot of right-wing Republicans give a lot to charity. They are the biggest charitable givers in the world. So I guess, I'm not sure if I'm expressing this well. I guess the innate desire or ability to do the right thing in the end for your fellow human being, that doesn't sound too Christmassy, would be cause for optimism.
Sapiens beat that out of me. The book Sapiens beat that out.
I've been trying to read that damn book after you talked about it.
What makes you optimistic, Keith?
Well, I think you can look around the world and see that we are not making some of the mistakes that we made in the past, even while we appear to be doing that. Our conversations are much wider now. And I mean, not personal conversations like this, but conversations about what we want in the world, what the agenda should be. I tend to get overshadowed by, a lot of the screaming that goes on in our politics and so on. But there are more people included in those conversations now, and I think that's a necessary part, not just to solutions, but to having any kind of optimism about the future, to know that you're listening to a wider range of people than you were before. And, 100 years ago, who were we listening to? We were listening to people like me, white men of a certain age and a certain experience in life, and that's it. That's past forever, I think. And I think that I don't think that can be a bad thing. I think it forces people who look like me and have my experience to consider things they might have not considered in another era. But how could that possibly be a bad thing?
So there's some, despite your temptation to say all the progress we thought that was being made hasn't been made, when you watch something like Trump, along the lines of what Keith was just saying, do you know anybody who's against gay marriage or gives a damn anymore? If they
I don't.
If they are, they're 95 years old. Yeah. My 85-year-old mother says, I guess, people should be entitled to, oh boy. My mother went to the United Church of Canada.
Yeah, this was an issue in the most recent federal election in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, but it cut the other way.
In a way that there was a leader of a national political party who wasn't prepared to say he was comfortable with it.
And lost because of it.
In part.
Yeah, not just in part. It was a big factor in killing.
But take that example away from it, just look at the trajectory of that issue.
Nothing's ever moved faster.
And
Social issues.
Because people thought for themselves about it. They stripped away the bullshit from the arguments against it. They identified real people in their own families and circles of friends that they could relate to in order to understand the issue. And to me, what was always the most telling thing was that while there was this big herd of people being persuaded in one direction, it was one direction, just one direction. I don't know that I've seen, heard, read anybody who said, I used to be in favor of same-sex marriage, but I think it's wrong.
Right. Since we've experimented with it, everything's gone to shit. All right. On that happy note, I think we have to wrap up. I so admire you two gentlemen, and in addition to being friends with you, I so admire you and your work over the years, and I'm thrilled that you were prepared to come on my little podcast and talk to people. So thank you very much. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association. I'd like to thank Canada 2020 in Ottawa for hosting us here, and everybody for listening. Please give us a rating on iTunes or a shout out on social media. It really helps get the word around, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.